It started with a pattern that never missed. Same moves, same timing, same outcome, every single time. People didn't care who built it. They didn't ask who was behind it. That was the whole point. No ego, no emotions, just numbers doing their thing. Cold, clean, reliable. Way better than trusting some random person online. Screens lit up with green. Accounts ticked upward while everything else looked shaky. Friends texted screenshots like they'd cracked a cheat code. Rent money doubled. Savings finally breathed. Someone said, "This thing prints while I sleep." And honestly, it looked true. What made it dangerous wasn't the money. It was the calm. No wild promises. No loud flexing. Just a quiet rhythm that felt smarter than fear. People told themselves this wasn't luck. This was logic. Math doesn't lie, right? But here's the part nobody noticed at first. The pattern wasn't reacting to the market. The market was reacting to the pattern. And that should have freaked everyone out. It didn't. Open loop number 1. Because buried inside that perfect consistency was a tiny detail almost no one questioned. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Days passed. Then weeks. Confidence turned into routine. Routine turned into dependency. People stopped checking anything else. Why would they? The pattern handled it. Until one morning, the numbers felt off. Not wrong. Just different enough to ignore. A delay here. A skipped cycle there. Nothing major. Nothing worth panicking over. That's when the excuses showed up. Clean ones. Logical ones. The kind that sound smart enough to shut you up. And the scariest part? The pattern didn't break on accident. Because what happened next wasn't a glitch. It was a decision. And once that switch flipped, there was no way back. By the time anyone questioned it, the stakes were already real. This wasn't play money. This was rent. College funds. Emergency cash people promised themselves they'd never touch. Regular folks who didn't feel reckless, because reckless would have meant trusting a person. This felt safer than that. The risk wasn't obvious at first. There were no alarms, no sketchy DMs, no pressure tactics. The danger sat quietly in the structure. Money went in on schedule. Money came out on schedule. Until one day, it didn't. And when that happened, there was no one to call. No face to confront. No human to blame. Just a system that suddenly stopped answering. Victims weren't just the desperate. They were the careful ones. The planners. The people who ran spreadsheets and swore they'd never fall for hype. Some only put in a little. Others went all in after watching it work long enough to feel proven. They weren't chasing crazy gains. They were chasing certainty. And that's what made the fallout brutal. When the pattern failed, it failed everywhere at once. Accounts froze mid-cycle. Balances showed numbers that couldn't be touched. Messages flooded in, all asking the same thing. Is it just me? It wasn't. And that realization hit like a gut punch. Here's the promise of this story. You're going to see exactly how a pattern can feel more trustworthy than a person, and why that instinct gets exploited hard. You'll see the subtle signals people missed, the moment when control quietly shifted, and the exact mechanism that turned confidence into silence. But we're not starting with the collapse. Because to understand why so many smart people ignored the risk, you have to see where this thing came from. Not the hype version. The real beginning. The moment someone realized that if you remove the face, you remove suspicion. And that origin. That's where the trap was set. The idea didn't start as a scam. That's the part people still struggle with. It started as a shortcut. A way to remove the messiest variable from decision-making. Humans. Anyone who's watched money long enough knows people ruin systems. They panic. They chase. They hesitate. They override rules at the worst possible moment. So the pitch, at least in the beginning, was simple. What if the system never had feelings? What if it followed a fixed pattern every time, no matter what the headlines said? On paper, that sounded reasonable. Smart, even. The seed was planted during chaos. Markets swinging hard. Feeds full of noise. Everyone claiming they had the answer, then disappearing when things went south. In that environment, a pattern felt like relief. No opinions. No predictions. Just repetition. Same entry. Same exit. Same window. Over and over. The logic was clean. If a behavior repeats often enough, you don't need to understand why it works. You just need to know that it works. Casinos are built on that idea. So are insurance tables. So are a lot of legit systems people trust every day. That's where the first quiet assumption slipped in. The pattern was framed as self-contained. It didn't depend on news. It didn't depend on timing the top or bottom. It didn't depend on anyone being right. It just depended on consistency. And consistency is easy to believe in when early results line up. At first, the numbers backed it up. Not explosive. Not flashy. Just steady. The kind of gains that don't trigger skepticism. The kind that make you nod and say, yeah, that tracks. Here's retention trigger number 1. Contradiction. On the surface, it looked conservative. Underneath, it was taking a risk most people didn't even know existed. The seed grew because it didn't ask for trust. It replaced trust with process. People weren't told to believe in someone's skill. They were told to believe in repetition. And repetition feels scientific. Predictable. Almost boring. That boredom was the hook. Early adopters tested it small. They watched cycles complete. They watched balances update. They watched the same thing happen again and again. Each successful loop wasn't just profit, it was confirmation. Confirmation that this wasn't luck. This was structure. And once something feels structural, people stop questioning it. What made it even easier to swallow was the absence of a hero. No loud personality. No mastermind claiming genius. Just a system doing what it was designed to do. That lack of a face made it feel neutral. Objective. Safe. But here's what wasn't obvious yet. For the pattern to work that smoothly, someone had to decide the rules. Someone had to choose the timing. Someone had to decide when the pattern ran, and when it didn't. That detail got buried under charts and cycles and calm explanations. Retention trigger number 2. Open loop. Because the most important part of the pattern wasn't the math. It was who had the power to pause it. At this stage, nobody thought about that. Why would they? Everything was working. The seed had roots now. And once people started building their plans around it, bills, goals, timelines, it stopped being an experiment. It became infrastructure. And that's when the idea crossed a line. Not from smart to stupid, but from reasonable to dangerous. Because the moment people stopped asking who controls the pattern stopped being just a tool. It became leverage. And that leverage came from the very beginning, right when the seed was planted. The first proof didn't arrive as a big win. That's why it worked. It showed up as small, boring success, the kind that doesn't trigger alarm bells. A cycle completed. A balance updated. A withdrawal landed exactly when it was supposed to. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to feel real. People shared screenshots quietly at first. Not to brag, but to confirm. Did yours do this too? Same numbers. Same timing. Same result. That consistency mattered more than the amount. Anyone can fake a big win. Faking repetition is harder, or at least, that's what everyone thought. The early truth was partial, but it was still truth. Money did move. Payouts did happen. For some, it happened more than once. That was all it took. Confidence didn't spike. It settled in. Once the first withdrawals cleared, the tone changed. Conversations shifted from testing it to scaling it. People didn't rush. They increased slowly, like responsible adults. 10% more. Then 20. Watching the pattern absorb it without flinching. Social proof snowballed without anyone trying to hype it. A few success stories turned into threads. Threads turned into daily updates. Not loud. Not flashy. Just steady confirmation that the system did what it claimed. And here's the clever part. The system never promised perfection. It promised structure. When a cycle ran a little late, the explanation made sense. When returns varied slightly, that was framed as normal variance. It all sounded mature, measured, real. On paper, everything still checked out. What people didn't realize was that these early wins served a second purpose. They weren't just payouts. They were training. Teaching users what normal looked like. Teaching them how long to wait. Teaching them what delays were acceptable. Foreshadowing. Those expectations would later be used against them. As trust grew, so did the sample size. More deposits. More cycles. More confirmations. Each successful round didn't just prove the pattern, it buried doubt deeper. Skeptics looked paranoid now. Anyone questioning it sounded emotional, not analytical. And the system benefited from that peer pressure. Nobody had to silence critics. The crowd did it naturally. Relax. It's working. Look at the data. But the data only showed what it was allowed to show. Behind the scenes, the pattern stayed just flexible enough to adapt. Parameters shifted slightly. Timing windows stretched. Nothing big enough to raise alarms. Just enough to keep everything running smooth under increased load. That adaptability was framed as strength. Partial truth. Yes, the pattern adjusted. Yes, payouts were real. Yes, the system was functioning. What wasn't discussed was why it needed to adjust at all. Because a truly fixed pattern doesn't need human decisions. This one did. And those decisions were invisible. Still, the proof kept coming. More confirmations. More screenshots. More stories about bills paid and stress relieved. For some people, this was the first time money felt predictable. That emotional payoff locked them in harder than profit ever could. Foreshadowing again. The moment predictability feels guaranteed is the moment risk stops being monitored. By the end of this phase, the question wasn't, does it work? It was, how long can I run it? And nobody noticed that the system had quietly answered that question already. The real engine wasn't the pattern. It was trust, built piece by piece, without ever asking for it directly. Authority without a face. There was no single leader to question, and that made everything feel safer. Authority didn't come from a person claiming expertise. It came from structure. Dashboards. Timers. Rules that looked fixed. When something feels systemized, people assume someone smarter already stress-tested it. The language helped. Technical. No hype. No urgency. Updates read like maintenance notes, not sales copy. That tone signaled competence. It told people, this is handled. Here's the contradiction no one noticed. Real authority usually explains itself. This one hid behind simplicity. The less it said, the more confident it sounded. Retention trigger number 1. Contradiction. On the surface, the lack of a spokesperson reduced risk. In reality, it removed accountability. As more people joined, authority scaled automatically. New users didn't need to trust the system. They trusted the crowd already using it. And the crowd looked rational. Quiet. Adult. Media-style validation. No mainstream headlines. No big features. But that absence worked in its favor. Instead, the system lived in screenshots, clips, and reposts that felt organic. Someone sharing a small win. Someone explaining how they tested it, just to be safe. Someone casually mentioning it worked better than expected. It looked like discovery, not promotion. These fragments acted like micromedia. Dozens of independent confirmations, all saying roughly the same thing. No scripts. No polish. Just proof that felt too boring to be fake. That's when people stopped asking who built it and started asking how to get in. What no one asked yet was why all the proof looked similar. Same tone, same pacing, same kind of win. As attention grew, explanations tightened. FAQs appeared. Simple diagrams. Clarifications that anticipated concerns before they were voiced. It felt responsive. Responsible. Like someone was paying attention. And someone was. Influencers without labels. There were no paid endorsements. At least, none that looked paid. Instead, certain voices emerged naturally. Users who understood the system well enough to explain it. Users who answered questions calmly. Users who posted consistent updates and never seemed emotional. They became guides. People trusted them because they weren't selling anything. They were just users. That distinction mattered. Advice from peers feels safer than advice from experts. Less agenda. More honesty. But influence doesn't require contracts. It requires visibility. Those visible voices would later be the first to go quiet. As these figures gained traction, their confidence reassured everyone else. If they weren't worried, why should anyone be? Their steady presence smoothed over doubts before they formed. Mini-Beat 4. Community as reinforcement. The group itself became a filter. Questions that challenged the system were answered quickly, but always calmly. No hostility. Just logic. Charts. Past results. Anyone pushing too hard was labeled anxious or impatient. The system didn't silence critics. The culture did. That culture rewarded patience. It praised discipline. It framed doubt as emotional weakness. The message was clear without being stated: trust the process. As trust deepened, deposits grew, and the system adjusted again. Small rule changes rolled out as improvements. Efficiency tweaks. Better timing. Nothing that altered outcomes. Just enough to show evolution. People love systems that get smarter. It makes them feel future-proof. Nobody noticed that every improvement increased dependence. Normalizing delay. When minor delays happened, the community already knew how to respond. This happened before. It resolved itself. Zoom out. That response was learned behavior. Trained by months of partial truths and early proof. Delays weren't red flags anymore. They were features. Stress tests. Proof the system could handle pressure. Retention trigger number 5. Unanswered question. If delays were normal, what would abnormal even look like? By the end of this phase, trust wasn't emotional. It was mechanical. People didn't feel safe. They assumed safety. And assumptions are dangerous because they don't ask for evidence. The trust engine was now running on its own. No promotion needed. No reassurance required. The pattern didn't just hold money. It held belief. And once belief replaced oversight, the system no longer needed to earn trust. It already had it. At this point, nobody felt like they were taking a risk anymore. That's the part people forget. Risk feels sharp when you first touch it. After a while, it feels familiar. Routine. Safe. People weren't waking up wondering if it would fail. They were waking up expecting the same thing it had done yesterday. Check the numbers. See the update. Move on with the day. The pattern had slipped into the background of their lives, like a utility. Something you don't think about until it's gone. What they told themselves made sense. I didn't rush in. I tested it first. I pulled money out already. Those thoughts stacked up like armor. Every past success became proof against future doubt. If something had worked 10 times in a row, the 11th time didn't feel like a question. It felt like a guarantee. Here's the contradiction creeping in. The more cautious people thought they were being, the less closely they watched. When small changes showed up, they were processed through that confidence. A delay wasn't a warning. It was an exception. A rule tweak wasn't a concern. It was optimization. People didn't ignore the signals. They reinterpreted them in the safest way possible. Someone would notice something odd, then immediately talk themselves out of it. It's probably nothing. This happened before. Everyone else seems fine. Relief didn't come from answers. It came from agreement. And agreement was everywhere. That's when realizations started happening quietly, one person at a time. Not panic. Just a weird pause. Someone refreshing a screen longer than usual. Someone rereading an update to make sure they didn't miss a line. Someone thinking, that explanation sounded right, didn't it? But the moment that doubt formed, something else kicked in. Loss aversion. The fear of being wrong. Because questioning the system now didn't just mean you might lose money. It meant admitting you should have seen this coming. So people waited. They told themselves they'd act if it got worse. They told themselves one more cycle would clear things up. Waiting felt responsible. Pulling out felt emotional. And nobody wanted to be the emotional one. Another contradiction. Leaving early felt riskier than staying in. As time passed, dependence deepened. People stopped thinking in terms of total balance and started thinking in cycles. Just get through this one. The horizon kept shrinking. Long-term thinking disappeared. Survival mode took over, but quietly, politely. Then came the moment when reassurance flipped into realization. A delay that lasted too long. An update that said less than usual. A response that didn't quite answer the question being asked. Not dramatic. Just thin. And suddenly, people realized they were reading tone instead of facts. That's when the question changed. Not, is the pattern still working? But, who decides when it doesn't? That realization hit different. Because once you see that someone has control, you can't unsee it. The system stopped feeling neutral. It felt managed. And management means intention. Some people tried to rationalize it again. Every system needs oversight. This doesn't mean anything bad. But the comfort was gone. Trust had turned into negotiation. People weren't relaxed anymore. They were alert. And alert feels a lot like fear. The psychology flipped fast after that. Screenshots stopped feeling reassuring. Other people's calm started to feel suspicious. Silence from familiar voices felt louder than any announcement. Another realization landed, heavier than the last. If this was truly just a pattern, it wouldn't need explanations. That thought spread without being spoken. You could feel it in the way questions were phrased now. Shorter. Sharper. Less polite. The community tone shifted from confident to cautious to tense. Still, most people didn't exit. Not yet. Because hope is sticky. And the brain hates locking in a loss. People clung to the idea that this was just a rough patch, because the alternative meant accepting that the safety they built their plans around was never real. The final contradiction settled in. The longer they stayed to feel safe, the less control they actually had. By the time that fully sank in, The pattern wasn't just something they used. It was something they were trapped inside. And they were about to find out what happens when belief runs ahead of reality. At the peak, everything looked unstoppable. Not exciting. Not chaotic. Just solid. This was the phase people would later describe as the calm before everything went dark, but back then, it felt like arrival. Balances were higher than they'd ever been. Not just for a few people, across the board. Cycles cleared on time again. Delays faded into the background like they never mattered. Confidence snapped back fast, almost aggressively, like the system was offended anyone ever doubted it. Money poured in quietly. Bigger amounts. Longer commitments. People who had held back finally moved. People who had already doubled down went even further. The pattern absorbed it all without blinking. That's when scale stopped being a concept and became a number. The kind of number that makes people sit back and say, "This thing is real." Too many users. Too much volume. Too much history to just vanish. The system felt institutional now. People built plans around it. Real plans. Quitting second jobs. Postponing stress. Treating the pattern like a baseline income. Conversations changed from, "if it keeps working," to, "since it works." That one-word shift locked everything in. The confidence was contagious. Skepticism sounded outdated. Anyone still questioning things got brushed off gently. "You're overthinking it. Look how far it's come. Nothing this big just disappears." Here's the contradiction nobody wanted to face. The bigger it got, the safer it felt. And the safer it felt, the less anyone looked under the hood. At the peak, even risk felt optimized. People spread funds across cycles. They staggered entries. They called it diversification, but it all flowed through the same system. Different doors, same room. Money moved so smoothly that people stopped checking confirmations. They trusted that updates would arrive when they always had. The pattern didn't need attention anymore. It had earned autopilot. Behind that confidence was something darker. The system was now too big to question without consequences. If it failed, it wouldn't just hurt individuals. It would wipe out entire communities at once. That thought alone kept people quiet. And quiet reads like agreement. The proof felt overwhelming. History. Volume. Testimonials stacked on testimonials. The idea that it could all be wrong started to feel ridiculous. Statistically impossible. Emotionally exhausting. That's how the peak works. It doesn't feel risky. It feels inevitable. At the very top, one last reassurance came through. Clean. Brief. Confident. It didn't say much, just enough to signal control. The kind of message that tells everyone, "Relax. We've got this." And everyone did. They ignored how polished it sounded. They ignored how final it felt. They ignored how it closed more questions than it answered. This was maximum trust. Maximum exposure. Maximum silence. And still, nothing stopped it. No regulator. No platform. No whistleblower. No internal brake. Not even the users who sensed something was off but stayed anyway because leaving felt harder than believing. That's the part that hits later. Because when people finally looked back, the question wasn't why did it fail. It was something colder. How did so many smart people watch it reach this size? And still assume someone else was in charge of stopping it? It didn't break all at once. It thinned. At first, the updates came a little later than usual. Not late enough to trigger alarms. Just late enough to be noticed. People checked timestamps. Refreshed. Shrugged. The pattern had earned patience by now. Then one cycle slipped. Not failed. Slipped. A soft delay with a clean explanation. Technical load. High volume. routine stuff, the kind of language that sounds responsible when you want to believe it. Countdown started anyway. Nobody said it out loud. 3 days in, questions multiplied faster than answers. Screens filled with the same message repeated by different people, worded slightly differently, all asking the same thing. Is anyone else waiting? The responses came quick, calm, reassuring. For now. 2 days later, the tone shifted. Replies got shorter. Updates got vaguer. Familiar voices stopped posting as much. Some disappeared completely. That silence hit harder than any bad news. 1 day after that, the rules changed. Nothing major. Just a small adjustment. A new condition. A reminder to wait. It was framed as protection. In reality, it reset the clock. And everyone felt it. Internal panic didn't look like chaos. It looked like overanalysis. People rereading terms. Comparing screenshots. Running timelines. Trying to math their way out of uncertainty. Escalation came fast. Another cycle paused. Then another. People started counting hours instead of days. Sleep schedules shifted. Phones stayed on charge. Every notification spike sent adrenaline through rooms full of people who had never met. The reassurance posts sounded different now. Less confident. More forced. Phrases like "stay patient" and "trust the process" showed up more often than actual information. That's when the first real warning appeared. A message that answered a question nobody had asked yet. Defensive. Over-explained. It tried too hard to sound normal. And that's when people realized something was wrong. The countdown tightened. Accounts showed balances that couldn't be touched. Pending statuses stacked up. Timers disappeared. Or worse, they reset. Each reset felt like a punch to the gut. Private messages spiked. Smaller groups formed. People comparing notes in side channels, trying to figure out if anyone had gotten out. Almost no one had. Then came the delay that crossed the line. No explanation this time. Just silence. That's when panic turned internal. People didn't scream yet. They froze. Because freezing buys time. Freezing avoids admitting the worst. Everyone waited for someone else to confirm what they were afraid to say. The escalation was complete. By the time the first person typed the word "gone," most people already knew. They just weren't ready to say it. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was instant. Access vanished first. Pages that loaded for months stopped responding. Dashboards froze mid-refresh. Login attempts looped back to nothing. No error message. No warning. Just dead space where control used to be. Then the explanations disappeared. Updates stopped entirely. The last message stayed pinned, calm and outdated, like a bad joke nobody wanted to laugh at. Every minute it stayed there made the silence louder. People scrambled. Screenshots flew. Timestamps got compared. Everyone trying to figure out the same thing, when it happened. Because knowing when feels like knowing why. It didn't help. Exposure came fast. Balances weren't delayed anymore. They were unreachable. Numbers without exits. Proof without access. The realization hit hard and clean. Whatever this was, it wasn't coming back. Attempts to recover turned into noise. Support channels collapsed under their own weight. Messages went unanswered. Links broke. Familiar usernames vanished. The structure that once felt solid evaporated like it had never existed. No shutdown notice. No final explanation. No apology. Just absence. And in that absence, the truth settled in. This wasn't a failure. It was a stop. A decision executed cleanly, at scale, without resistance. By the time people accepted that, It was already over. Everything they trusted to hold was gone. What came after wasn't just loss. It was silence turning into math. People calculating damage in real time, replaying decisions they once felt proud of. The money was gone, but the bigger hit was trust. Trust in systems, in logic, in their own judgment. The lesson didn't age out. It upgraded. Today, the patterns look cleaner. The language sounds smarter. The faces are still missing on purpose. Automation, AI, algorithms, different words, same promise. Remove emotion. Remove people. Remove risk. That's the lie. Any system that asks you to trust the structure more than the controller is setting a trap. Real safety shows its limits. It explains failure. It doesn't hide behind consistency. The next version won't look like this one. It never does. Final warning loop. If you can't see who can stop the system, you're not watching a pattern. You're watching an exit.